You all have been using critical hits the wrong way. What's up? I'm Syrobe, and I'm still inventing groundbreaking builds that push the limits of Elden Ring more than a year later. I consider this build to be my best video so far. It breaks every boss's stance almost instantly with an infinite stagger chain and deals the highest amount of critical damage possible. Literally stun lock and one-shot almost every boss in Elden Ring. I've been making builds since Elden Ring release, and all my builds use an honest setup as I always cap my level at 125, never use great runes, and only use practical buffs to get the damage you see in all my videos. But I'll get more into the build specifics at the very end. When the Elden Ring DLC drops, this will be the best channel to get builds from, so be sure to drop a fat fucking like and a massive sub, because as always, I do all the research and editing for these videos myself, and would love to have you join the Syrobe Nation, which is now almost 2 times the population of Greenland. But first, are you itching for something new to play while waiting for Elden Ring's DLC? Wanted Dead is on sale right now for 50% off for Xbox and PlayStation consoles, and also available on PC. Wanted Dead is an epic cyberpunk hack-and-slash action game from a brand new publisher known as 110 Industries. Developed by the team behind renowned titles like Ninja Gaiden and Dead or Alive. This game embodies the spirit of the beloved PS3 and Xbox 360 era of classic gaming and latches onto your nostalgia to take you back to when times were a bit simpler. Despite the serious setting, the game has a very self-aware approach with ridiculously fun gameplay and an over-the-top chaotic story. The combat is also very similar to the typical Souls-like style that you all know and love and are familiar with. This game is a love letter to completionists, featuring challenging boss encounters at the end of each level with creative boss fights that have unique movesets and fighting styles. Wanted Dead offers an experience like no other, so hurry up because that 50% sale ends on July 25th for Xbox and August 2nd for PlayStation consoles. Be sure to check it out now on Xbox, PlayStation, or PC by using my link in the description below, and enjoy. With that out of the way, some of you may have noticed this little bar on my screen. I am using an educational program to allow enemy stance health bars to be seen. This is not normally possible if that wasn't already obvious. And yes, I know it says Poise, but just ignore that. I didn't make this and it's a typo. Poise means something else completely, which is a video for another day. Anyways, an enemy stance health bar is a hidden value that exists within the code of Elden Ring, but is always invisible to you and everyone else playing. So this program creates a visual representation of that code that already exists within the game. Stance health functions almost exactly the same as the actual posture bar featured in Sekiro for any enjoyers watching. Rest assured, all of the damage numbers you see in this video are not modified and are 1000% legit. I'll even link all my spreadsheet data in the description below. So let's get into this because there is a lot. Gonna try and keep it simple and break this video down into 5 sections. What is a stance break? How critical hits and critical damage works, how to generate infinite critical hits, the highest critical damage weapon, and lastly, a summary posting all the stats, gear, and setups to use at the end. First up, what is stance break? To put it simply, every possible attack that hits an enemy deals a certain amount of stance health damage. Much like bleed or poison resistances, every enemy also has a hidden value for stance health, which can greatly vary and is not affected by their regular health or defensive stats. So doing a fuck ton of damage with an attack doesn't actually break a boss's stance any faster. Your damage to enemy stance health bars varies on the type of weapon, spell, or Ash of War that you use. After dealing stance damage, there's around a 5-second grace period before an enemy's stance health begins to regenerate. But higher stance HP values like Radon, for example, takes a lot longer before it starts regenerating. I made a quick list of all the main boss stance health values that I'll leave in the description below if anyone's interested, but keeping it simple, 80 stance health seems to be the lowest shared value among most bosses, while Radon is the maximum beefy outlier with 200 stance health. Truly the mightiest demigod. Now, stance health represents how much stance damage you need to deal within a short amount of time to break an enemy's stance, which is when you usually get to perform a critical hit. Yes, I say usually because this is just a Miyazaki moment where every boss can be stance broken, but some bosses like the Tree Sentinel or Loretta can't take a critical hit after you stance break them, just like an awkward stun thing. Anyways, stance health will always end up regenerating, so you have to keep the pressure on, or you'll find yourself killing a boss before you ever actually get to break its stance. To prevent an enemy's stance HP from regenerating after you hit them, it's always a good idea to keep some throwing knives on you. Throwing knives are extremely fast and count as a hit that will reset the regeneration timer. This prevents any stance health from regenerating. I just prefer to use Kukuri because these have way more range than throwing knives and can build up bleed. Only drawback is the throwing animation is a lot slower, but that doesn't bother me. Next, how critical hits and critical damage work. works. This is a bit tricky. As you may have seen, every weapon in Elden Ring has a critical damage modifier represented by a number ranging from a minimum of 100 to the highest of 140 crit on the misericord. If I butchered that, my bad. These crit numbers on every weapon represents a percentage of how much your damage gets increased during a critical hit, so 100 being 2 times your damage and 140 being roughly 2.4 times. Most games that feature critical hits are randomly generated on a dice roll or a random number generator. Well, in Elden Ring, there are no random critical hits. Critical damage is guaranteed to happen to an enemy in 3 different ways: backstab, parry followed with a riposte, or a stance break critical hit. Backstabs do the least damage, while parrying and stance breaking do the most. The damage difference between these types of crit damage is not important because most bosses are immune to backstabs and few bosses can actually be parried, but every boss can have its stance broken. Side note, it doesn't matter if you two-hand or one-hand your weapon before you perform a critical hit because the damage will not change. So doing it one-handed is more efficient and two-handed doesn't give you any extra damage. Not only is stance breaking the most efficient method to generate critical hits, it's also the easiest as no enemy is immune to it and it has no cooldown, which is why we're focusing on specifically stance breaking to infinitely generate our critical hits. Which I'll explain now how to generate infinite critical hits. So now that we know what stance breaking is and that breaking an enemy's stance allows you to generate infinite critical hits, with over 500 weapons, spells, and Ashes of War in this game, how can we tell what the fastest method of stance breaking is? Short answer, you can't. Long nerd answer, basically every enemy has a fancy invisible stance health value and every attack has an equally fancy invisible value for its stance health damage that is never represented by any stat on the weapon or your character, and that stance damage changes depending on the weapon's class and the type of attack you use, all of which we can never physically see the numerical value of. Thanks, Miyazaki. So here's a quick table of data mine information that I found floating around the internet that contains pretty much all of the possible data for every attack value in a sea of algorithmic gibberish. Spoiler, it's the Wing of Astal. That's the best one. It's the fastest stance breaking weapon, so you'll just have to hear me out and trust me, because there's way too much to go through all of this. Let's use Margit as a glorified test dummy. He has the minimum base stance of 80 stance health. There are plenty of combinations to break an enemy's stance fast, but some stance break windows are super tiny, like Melania for example, that you might not even have time to pull that critical hit off if you stance break them with certain attacks, because she recovers faster than normal, as a lot of other late game bosses do too. Some attacks will leave you locked in their animation with little time to perform your critical hit or any additional setup. Previously, the best method to break an enemy's stance was the Flame of the Redmane's Ash of War, but that got nerfed into the ground and is dog shit for stance damage now. So naturally, the best replacement is the Wing of Astal with an oddly similar animation. But instead of doing stance damage instantly like the Flame of the Redmanes, players shoot out 10 explosive stars that deal around 13 stance damage per star on top of their regular magic damage. Realistically, you're going to hit about 3 to 4 explosions per cast, which is around 39 to 52 stance damage total. And this can also be increased to 16.9 stance damage per star after drinking the Stone Barb Tear in your physics flask, which is a 30% increase to all stance damage. With this, your average stance break output when hitting 3 to 4 stars is now a 50 minimum and 67.6 maximum stance damage total. The other main reason you need to use the Wing of Astal for stance breaking is that the Ash of War has a slight delay to the explosive projectiles, which is what we need to make this build work. You might think this is bad, but we will use this delay to our advantage because unlike 99% of attacks that might stance break bosses faster, the Wing of Astal doesn't keep us locked in any animation by the time the stars explode and deal their stance damage. This causes a delayed stance break, allowing us to use the delayed impact to maximize our setup in that extra window of opportunity to execute the perfect critical hit damage. As I mentioned earlier, other methods might be slightly faster to stance break bosses, but end up causing you to miss the critical hit opportunity entirely by taking too long to recover from. Now that we can infinitely break an enemy's stance, you'll need a powerful weapon for your critical hits to deal massive damage. So what is the highest critical damage weapon? This is a weapon most of you have never used before. Okay, it's the Executioner's Great Axe. Again, there's way too much information to go through this list, but just trust me on this one again. Most of you have probably thought that the best critical damage is the Misericord, as it has a critical modifier of 140. However, that's technically false. Due to the weapon's overall damage achieving a little over 500 damage, the 140 multiplier does not scale the damage that much higher. The Executioner's Great Axe is the best weapon I've found for critical hits at the meta level of 125. This weapon offers the highest possible damage with almost 800 base AR while also having a crit multiplier of 115. It's also super light compared to other weapons, and at level 125 we can still wear a full set of Black Knife armor so that we have some defensive stats still. It's fairly light, has solid range and powerful attacks, and it can also be used to stance break a boss insanely fast, as a charge heavy attack does 37 stance damage and 48 with the Stone Barb Crack tier, letting you stagger a boss in just 2 charge attacks. Combining these two weapons together for infinite stance breaking and optimal crit damage, if you were to land just 3 of the 10 Wing of Astal explosions from the Ash of War with the cracked tier, you can stance break almost every boss in the game in just 2 uses. And the Wing of Astal only takes 4 uses max to break Radahn's stance, which is the highest total stance health value in the game. Once you've stance broken a boss, which can infinitely be repeated, you use the Executioner's Great Axe to pull off that fat crit damage every time, which does over 10,000 damage for each critical hit.
Nice.
The way I achieve over 10,000 damage is with the use of a few practical buffs that have a ton of synergy and is the result of min-maxing to stay under level 125 and keep my damage as efficient as possible. Again, I use no references and do all of this through A/B testing. This section will cover all of my gear and stats and the setup that I use to get the same damage as me. For my gear, I use the Black Knife set for lightweight protection with the Mushroom Crown for its passive buff of 10% increase to all damage when near a source of poison. And with the Kindred of Rot Talisman that also has a 20% buff for also being near a source of poison, which both stack for a 32% increase to all sources of damage. I invented this technique of self-poisoning with the Fetid Pots long ago last year, which will activate both poison buffs, turning yourself into the source of poison, which activates both buffs that last for 20 seconds, and even if you cleanse the poison, you still keep the damage. Now for the rest of the talisman, we use the Dagger Talisman to get an extra 17% critical damage increase, the Fire Scorpion because our weapon is Flame Art Affinity and increases our fire scaling even further, and lastly the Radagon Sword Seal because of the way our base stats work, and I can already hear the people crying in my comments about the defense reduction, which I've already accounted for with the rest of our stats and gear. The most efficient starting class is the Vagabond, where we put 50 points into Vigor, use default mana, 20 Endurance, 29 Strength exactly, default Dex, and 20 Intelligence just to be able to use the Wing of Astal, and 50 Faith to use the extra buffs and cap out the soft cap for the Flame Art scaling on our Executioner's Great Axe. Which brings me to our weapons. Our only weapon in the right hand slot is the Executioner's Great Axe at max level, with the Flame Art Affinity, which makes the weapon deal physical and fire damage, scaling off your Faith and Strength stats, making it the highest damage affinity that synergizes with all our buffs and gives us access to a ton of extra spell buffs. For the Great Axe Ash of War, we use the Royal Knight's Resolve. The RKR usually increases your next attack by 80%, but on critical hits, it works a bit differently, and I found out that it only increases your damage by 35%, but this actually seems to work for both hits, as the game considers the 2-hit critical animation as a single attack, which might be a bug, but I'll take it. In our left-hand slots, we have the Wing of Astal just for the Ash of War, but by all means, max out its level and have the Ash of War deal insane damage. I kept mine at level 0 in all of my clips just to show off the critical damage from the Executioner's Great Axe, so max this thing out for any bosses that you don't already one-shot. And also in the left hand, we just have a base finger seal for casting incantation buffs. For our incantations, we have Flame Grant Me Strength, which buffs all of our physical and fire damage, which the Flame Art Executioner's Great Axe uses both. So we actually utilize the buff's full value even more with the Faith investment. Golden Vow gives us more damage, but also helps increase our defensive stats since our talisman reduces our defensive by quite a bit. And with the investment for our Flame Art Great Axe, we gain access to the optimal Black Flames protection, which brings our defensive stats all the way up to pseudo-max, which makes the fact that talisman reducing your defensive stats completely irrelevant. However, you can't use both Flame Grant Me Strength and Black Flame protection at the same time, so only use this if you feel too squishy. Both spells do stack with Golden Vow though. For consumables, to prevent the stagger HP regen, we keep Kukri or Throwing Knives, which is just up to your preference. As I mentioned before, the Mushroom Crown and Kindred of Rot Talisman are activated by the self-poison, which comes from the use of rope-fetid pots, which we will keep as consumables. And as a bonus, since we're dealing so much fire damage already, we can use the oil pots to coat an enemy in oil. This lasts for 25 seconds, but increases your fire damage by 50% for the next attack. From my testing, when consuming the oil pot buff on a critical hit, it only buffs the first part of the critical attack animation and not the second one, but this also seems a bit bugged. Anyways, for the final piece to our build, we use the Flame Shrouding Crack tier and the Stone Barb tier in our Physics Flask to get even more fire damage and a 30% increase to all stance HP damage. Combining all of this will let us infinitely stance break bosses and one-shot most of them. So this is what the setup will look like with all of the buff durations on screen. First, we pop Golden Vow as it's the longest buff, then Flame Grant Me Strength, followed by a blue pot in your physics buffs, save your poison pots until you enter a boss room, and immediately throw your oil pot at your target. Once the oil lands, activate the poison buffs, then go for a stance break with the Wing of Astal. On your last cast of the Astal Ash of War, right before the boss's stance is about to be broken, use your Royal Knight's Resolve right before the stance breaks so you can get the 10,000 critical hit damage the mathematically correct way. Thank you all so much for watching. This video took a lot of effort, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it because I have dedicated so much of my life to this game since it released. And even after its initial hype settled down, I still stuck with it because it's my passion, and I genuinely love everything about this game and the Souls franchise as a whole, and I hope this video reminds you all of how much you love it too. Honestly, I don't know how I'll ever top this video, so feel free to join my Discord and talk about Elden Ring ideas if you find something I didn't, or just to talk about anything else while we wait for the Elden Ring DLC. Thanks again for all the support and being a part of my journey, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.